Diane reaches home, tired and frustrated, and is about to take a warm bath when she gets a call on her home number. She has lost her mobile phone, and someone calls her from her own phone, as the number is saved as home in her contact list. Diane is relieved, and asks him about where he found it. The man explains that he saw her at the Garibaldi arguing with someone on the phone, after which she left without it. Diane is conscious about how she must have sounded to everyone there, and explains that she was arguing with her ex-husband, Bruno. She still doesn't understand why the man didn't just give her the phone when he saw her leave without it. He admits that he had the chance to do it, but he thought handing her the phone later this way would help him get her attention. Diane is amused and curious about him, but her bath overflows, and she asks the man to call her back. Thinking it is him again, she picks up the phone happily, but realizes Bruno is calling her to argue again. Diane is furious with him, and refuses to give in to what he wants. She also suggests that they can separate professionally, and wants to keep the phone, since she is expecting another call. When she gets another call, she assumes it is Bruno and gets angry. When she realizes it is the man with her phone, she warms up and continues her conversation. She explains that she has been separated from Bruno for 3 years, but he keeps irritating her. She then learns that his name is Alexander, and he wants to know why Bruno is troubling her. Diane is a lawyer, and she is having a disagreement with Bruno about a case in their law practice, where they are partners. As they keep talking, Alexander asks her for dinner, to give her phone back. Impressed by his persistence, she agrees to meet him at a cafe the next day. Diane walks to her office with confidence and excitement. She waits for Alexander at the cafe, and is in for a surprise when a grown man all of 4.5 feet tall approaches her. He apologizes for being late, while Diane is still trying to process his height. Alexander notices her discomfort, and directly addresses the elephant in the room. He asks if it is a problem that he is 16 inches shorter than her, but Diane has somewhat recovered, and politely assures Alexander that she was surprised initially, but it is not a big deal. Alexander understands that she was not expecting a grown man to be so short, so she just needs time to process it. He is a perfect gentleman, and vocal about his thoughts, and notices how people are looking at them sitting together and judging them. Alexander wants to know what Diane is doing after meeting him. She still feels a bit awkward, and is shy to talk to him, but informs him about a meeting with a client. Alexander tells her to cancel her meeting, which surprises her, but he wants to take her for a life-changing experience. He refuses to tell her about it, but Diane is impressed by his spontaneity. Alexander's friend Vanessa comes over to meet him, and he introduces her to Diane. He confidently then goes back to sit on the chair that is too big for him, and calls up Sebastian to ask for a plane in an hour. He assures Diane that the experience will be worth it. Diane is terrified, as she learns she and Alexander are about to jump from a height of 10 feet. Alexander is too excited, but Diane is scared for her life, and pleads with him to let her get out of there. He assures her it is safe, but she is still freaked out and in no mood to jump down. Since there seems to be no other way out, Diane eventually agrees, and Alexander helps them jump. They float in the air, and when they touch the ground, Diane is thrilled she tried it. She is grateful to Alexander for her giving her this experience. He has fed his number into her phone, and asks her to call him if she wants to get in touch. When she leaves, he drives home and tries to sneak inside his house, but his helper Monique notices him. But the one he was trying to avoid spots him, and Alexander waits in terror as their dog Lucio happily jumps all over him. Alexander cries for help from his son Benji, who insists that Lucio just loves him. Benji wants Alexander to talk to Monique about how distracted she has been at work, and how dirty their house has become. Alexander doesn't seem ready for the conversation, and insists that he cannot talk to her. Benji shows him a shirt that Alexander happily claims, since it isn't his size. Meanwhile, Diane is in the middle of a discussion with her clients, when suddenly she remembers something funny and laughs. Benji discusses a job offer he got with Alexander, which he refused since the salary was too low. Alexander feels Benji should do something he is passionate about. Benji informs him about an app idea he has, and that he needs investors like Timo Atainen, who understand great ideas and will be willing to invest. Following in the footsteps of his father, Benji insists that he wants to aim big. Alexander suggests that Benji could seek out the investor, but it is very difficult to meet him. Feeling a little disappointed, Benji asks for money from Alexander to go out with his friends. In her office, Diane searches for Alexander's number and thinks about calling him. She gets interrupted by her assistant Coralie, who is a little unsure about personal space, and stands too close to Diane. Since her eye is twitching, Coralie suggests it could be because of fatigue, or a recent emotional shock. Right then, the door opens, and someone comes to inform Diane about an email virus they are affected with. He makes Coralie nervous and blush, and when Diane stares at her, she automatically gets defensive and insists that she did not open any infected email, even if it doesn't sound very convincing. Diane gets a call from Bruno informing her about their client Leffert's hearing with the judge. Diane is pissed, since they had agreed on a settlement. When she keeps the phone, he barges into her office to discuss how they will work out if they separate professionally. Bruno even asks Coralie whose side she will be on when they separate, but Diane thinks that is very unfair, and dramatic of Bruno. In that moment, Diane tries to smooth things over and tells Bruno she will think about what needs to be done with the client. Meanwhile, Alexander, who is a wealthy and successful architect, is working on the plans for an extension to the Liege Opera, which is a very big project for him. He gets a call from Diane while he is at work and gets excited. Alexander is happy to hear from her, and they plan to meet that night at a place Alexander is excited about. Coralie hears her talking to him and hands her the file she asked for. Diane also tells her to postpone the hearing Bruno wanted, since she has decided to take a stand. At night, she finds herself in a suspicious-looking street and enters a dingy room. She bumps into Alexander in the dark and jumps in fright. He reassures her and takes her to a hidden bar inside, which is not completely legal, and easily gains entry. Diane is impressed with how well everyone seems to know Alexander there, and how polite they are with him. As things still seem a bit awkward between them, Alexander asks Diane to tell a joke to lighten the mood. Diane insists she is terrible at jokes, since they don't seem to land well with the punchline. Alexander then takes things into his own hands and cracks a joke about an Eskimo, which makes Diane laugh. Diane then attempts a joke, and they decide to make funny faces for fun. This relaxes them, and they start enjoying the dinner. Alexander drops Diane home and tells her about his competitor architect Carl Willems, who doesn't like him. Diane is pleased with the time they spent, and when Alexander calls her beautiful, she leans in to kiss him. When she reaches home, she feels very happy, and so does Alexander, but he is greeted with an overexcited Lucio, who jumps all over him again. The next day at the office, Bruno is angry about Diane postponing the hearing he had planned. While Bruno is concerned about saving their firm and earning a lot of money from their client, Diane doesn't morally agree with the client and feels he could ruin their reputation. They get into a screaming match and realize they cannot trust each other. But Bruno also notices something different about Diane and asks if she has met someone. Diane refuses to answer that and goes off to receive a call. Coralie, who heard her conversation, informs Bruno secretly about her dating someone called Alexander. Alexander is playing table tennis with Benji and makes fun of him as he loses. In the changing room, Alexander is dressed up and ready to go somewhere, which makes Benji suspicious, since he seems to be smiling. He informs Benji about attending a disco party with some friends and a girlfriend. Benji is interested and wants to know about the girl he is seeing, and even teases Alexander about seeming like he is in love. Alexander tells him about Diane and tries to make sure he looks fine before leaving. In her office, Diane is working late when Bruno comes to check on her. He nervously asks her about her plans for that night, and she informs him she has to go somewhere. When he leaves, she gets ready to meet Alexander. As he picks her up, Bruno watches them kissing in the car. They reach the disco party, where Diane and Alexander dance happily. He feels hesitant dancing with her in the crowd, but when he notices how much she is enjoying it, he forgets his nervousness and gets comfortable dancing. While dropping her off, they reach a crossroads, where he gives her an option of coming over to his place for the night. They reach his house, where they kiss in his room in front of the mirror. When Diane notices the mirror and how small Alexander is, she feels awkward, which Alexander realizes too, and stops kissing her. He asks her to look at him and assures her everything is fine, which is when they go back to kissing passionately. She wakes up the next day in his bed, with a note from him. Benji notices Diane sitting for breakfast, and goes to talk to her. Diane is thrilled to get a ready breakfast, and Benji also assures her that his father is a great guy. He asks Diane if she has any kids, and how her relationship with her ex-husband is, since his father is very cordial with his mother. At his meeting, Alexander is happy about his life. In Diane's office, Bruno and Coralie discuss Alexander, and Bruno insists that he is a rich midget, information which is hard to swallow for Coralie. She brings Diane her coffee and insists that Bruno wants to see her. Diane doesn't understand the rush, but Coralie keeps asking her questions about her boyfriend in between. Diane clarifies that she is dating Alexander, but he is not her boyfriend. When Coralie wants to know if Diane is ashamed of Alexander, she realizes that she feels in love while she is with him, but when she is away, she feels weird about his height. She also confesses that she always dreamed of being with the tall Prince Charming, and being with Alexander feels weird for her. She then goes to see Bruno, who wants to discuss about their client, even if Diane is still taking her stand. Bruno distastefully calls her Snow White, referring to Alexander as the dwarf, which infuriates Diane. Alexander is walking with a friend when someone knocks him over. When he looks back, he apologizes to Alexander and insists he did not see him. Alexander is a little offended, but there is nothing he can do, so he walks off. Diane starts shopping for Alexander, but can't find anything in his size. She finally decides to go to a kid's shop, where she nervously has to dodge questions about the age of the person she is buying a sweater for. Benji reaches the airport in excitement with his suitcase, and feels that his father is taking him somewhere special. Alexander asks him to sit with him, and tells him a story from his childhood about wanting to drive a tractor on a farm, and how his father helped him do it on his own. After telling Benji this story, Alexander points at Timo Atainen at the airport and tells him to sell his app idea to him before his flight leaves. Benji knows he has no other option. Back at home with Diane and Alexander, Benji recounts the story of how he got the investor to give him his number to discuss his project. He then gets a call and goes to receive it with excitement. Diane feels what Alexander did for Benji is very sweet, and even gives him his present. When Alexander looks at the sweater, he does not know what to say, which makes Diane feel he doesn't like it. Alexander insists that he loves it a lot, but it just has been a long time since he got any gifts. Alexander is discussing the expansion plans for the opera with his team, and makes a comment about aiming big, which makes one of his colleagues laugh. He is quick to notice that, and when he prods him to understand why he was smiling, everyone around him gets awkward. He then stands on the table to make his point, but eases into the conversation, and everyone is relieved. At home, Diane is laughing at his stories about how he has to be tough with his height. He then seriously asks her if she is hiding him from people in her life. When he asks about her parents, Diane hesitates, but knowing how much Alexander wants to meet them, she invites him for a gallery opening with her mom and her stepdad the next day. At the gallery opening, Diane's mother Nicole is ogling the pictures on display with her friend Christine. She discusses how her husband Philippe would not be too happy with her bringing such pictures home. They then spot Alexander coming towards them, and get excited about seeing a midget. When he comes towards Diane, she introduces him to her mother and Christine as a friend. Alexander is his usual chivalrous self while talking to them, and a nervous Diane heads over to the bar to get them some drinks, while he talks to the women about the pictures on display. Diane and Alexander then join Philippe and Nicole for dinner. Nicole happily discusses architecture with Alexander, while Diane continues to feel awkward when she notices people at the table next to hers constantly laughing at him. Philippe is hard of hearing, and tries to strike up a conversation with Alexander. When Nicole asks if Alexander's shortness is hereditary, he explains that everyone in his family is normal. The whole conversation is making Diane more nervous, and she looks for more wine. Alexander keeps trying to engage in conversation with Nicole, and asks about her interests. Diane cannot take it anymore, and gets up to tell the people at the next table off for constantly laughing at them. When she gets back, Alexander has gone to receive a call, and Nicole starts making jokes about his height. Diane is not amused, and tells her to be respectful. But when Nicole asks how she knows Alexander, Diane insists he is just a client. After dinner, Diane is relieved the night is finally over. Alexander also realizes how bad the night was, and asks Diane if he should keep believing in them. Diane tries to protest initially, but gives in and expresses her frustration. She discusses how she is always worried about Alexander, and people making fun of him in public. She also confesses that she was not expecting to meet someone like him, and she likes it, but is not able to accept all the problems. Alexander just stands there and listens to her. He still wants to know if he can go on believing in them. And Diane kisses him, and assures him she is with him. When he reaches home and bangs on the door, Lucio is ready to pounce on him, but Alexander is not in the mood. In her office, Diane is on a call with a counselor, and learns that Bruno has slept with the judge. She still tries to fight for the ethics of their firm when Coralie comes in with too much excitement on her face, and announces that Alexander has come to meet her. Diane instructs the counselor to change the judge, and asks Coralie where Bruno is. She doesn't want him to meet Alexander, and plans with Coralie to keep him distracted. They both go to receive Alexander, and Coralie, who is very excited to see a grown man of his size, talks to him in a baby voice, and offers to get him a little glass of coffee. In Diane's office, he sits in her chair and waits for her to finish her work. In a while, an angry Bruno enters and shouts at Diane for changing judges. In his anger, he starts banging the chair Alexander is sitting in, since he can't see him from behind. It is only when he goes to sit on the chair that he realizes Alexander is there too. He apologizes for not noticing him, just when Coralie comes with a straw and water for Alexander. Diane takes Bruno outside to discuss the issue. Diane asks if Bruno slept with the judge, but Bruno is still fascinated by Alexander, and wants to know if he is a real midget. He also wonders what is wrong with Diane, since she would do anything to win a case in the past, but she has softened now, and seems like she has given up. Diane and Alexander watch a movie which amuses him, but she feels distracted and upset in the beginning. In the morning, Alexander drives up to Bruno's car and rolls down his window to politely ask Bruno to leave Diane alone. He insists that Diane is with him now, and Bruno needs to accept that. This makes Bruno angry, and he asks Alexander to get out of his car. Alexander still tries to reason with him, but Bruno starts abusing him. Alexander prepares to fight Bruno as people watch, which makes Bruno realize the whole thing is a mess, and he drives off. At a distance, Alexander catches up with Bruno again, and calmly tells him to join Diane and him at a party on Saturday. He then drives off, leaving a shocked Bruno behind. Diane meets her mom as she is driving and discusses her love life. Nicole is excited and wants to know who Diane is dating. When she mentions Alexander, her face completely changes, and she starts driving very rashly, and almost hits many cars and maybe a passerby on the way. She keeps driving on the wrong way, even when Diane shouts for her to watch out. Nonetheless, that is Diane's opportunity to tell her mom that she loves Alexander and wants to marry him. They almost end up crashing into a bus, but Diane pulls the brakes at the last minute. At Alexander's party, Bruno has joined them and compliments him on the house. He then asks for the washroom and heads inside. When Alexander doesn't see Monique serving the guests, he goes in to check on her. He wants to take the appetizers out to the guests himself, but needs napkins too, which are too high up on the shelf. Since his stool isn't enough, he piles up a few books and climbs on top. While reaching for the napkins, he loses control over the stool and is left hanging from the shelf. This amuses Bruno after the warning Alexander gave him earlier, and he tries to call Diane to embarrass Alexander in front of her. Alexander protests and reminds Bruno that Diane isn't his wife anymore. He then proposes a manly challenge for him, like ping pong. Just when Diane finally hears her name and comes in, she notices Alexander and Bruno sitting together suspiciously and smiling at her. Alexander then asks Diane to take the appetizers outside. When he tries to take some out too, he is defeated by Lucio, who jumps on him and makes him fall. Philippe notices how worried Nicole looks and asks her about it. She expresses her worry for Diane, since she is dating Alexander. When Philippe thinks that it's obvious, since her mother is also married to a deaf man, Nicole doesn't agree with the comparison, and insists that it is different to date a man so much shorter than her, which frustrates Philippe and he walks off. In her office, Diane hears a noise and goes to check on Bruno. She watches him play ping pong with himself. Diane and Alexander are out for ice cream, and when he goes to get one, Diane bumps into the shopkeeper she bought Alexander's sweater from. She introduces Diane to her son, who is wearing the same sweater, and asks her about her son. It gets a lot more awkward when Alexander comes next to her with the same sweater the woman's son is wearing, and the same ice cream. At his house, Diane paces in frustration while Alexander tries to comfort her and talk to her. She wants to know if he gets mad about all this, but Alexander has been short his whole life and doesn't know any other way. Diane insists she doesn't have a problem with him being short, but admits it is painful to watch sometimes. Diane looks at him long and hard and discusses how loved and understood she feels with him, which is a very rare feeling. When she starts talking about how she wants to stay with him, Alexander knows she is ending their relationship and that she can't be with him. He asks if he ever hid his height from her or lied to her. Diane agrees that she has always known about his height and what other people think shouldn't matter to her, but it does because she has an idea of how love is supposed to look like, and it is not easy with him. Alexander is disappointed, but asks her to go home. She leaves and drives back, with tears in her eyes. Alexander finally sounds frustrated as he discusses construction plans on the phone. He also, for the first time, firmly scolds Monique for not doing her work well. Since he asks her to stop vacuuming, Monique is confused about what he wants and leaves the house. Alexander starts vacuuming the floor himself when Benji comes and notices how upset he looks. He tells him to forget about Diane and feels she is not worth it, even as Alexander insists she tried her best. He then asks Benji about how he sees him. Benji thinks of him as a friend and a parent, and insists that his height has never bothered him, because Alexander never made him feel weird about it. When Benji asks if being small has been painful, Alexander admits that it has always bothered him, but pretending he doesn't care helps him through it. Bruno hangs out near the court and gets introduced to Leffert's ex-wife. In the office, Diane comes to talk to him, and he seems pleased to see her smile. He informs her that he has agreed to let Leffert go as a client, just like she wanted. Diane is impressed with this step, and Bruno's apparent realization of the ethical issue with representing Leffert. But that feeling is short-lived when Bruno explains how they will be representing his wife, and Diane immediately knows he has slept with her too. She is disgusted by Bruno and leaves the room, even as he insists they can get rich by taking the case. Diane feels upset and wonders what to do with her life. Alexander, too, is unable to focus on work. Diane goes to meet Alexander in his house, but meets Benji instead, who is cold to her and refuses to tell her where he is. When she insists she is not his enemy, and the whole situation is complicated for her too, Benji tells her to forget his father and leave him alone. Diane is devastated and can't stop crying when Coralie talks to her about her upbringing, and how all of them are brought up to feel a certain way about someone so short. Coralie's enthusiasm about the subject reassures Diane a little bit, but she is still in tears when her mom comes to check on her. Nicole apologizes for acting the way she did, and insists that Diane needs to find Alexander and tell him how she feels. Diane decides to jump off a plane at the Liege to reach Alexander, and while she confidently begins her plan, jumping down is still hard for her. She somehow manages to convince herself and slowly reaches the site in her parachute. She notices Alexander midair and calls out to him, but since she is too far away, he is unable to hear or see her. When his team turns around a corner, they all notice someone struggling to get out of a parachute, and when they realize it is Diane, they leave Alexander alone. Diane finally admits her true feelings for Alexander. She knows their life together won't be easy, but she has stopped bothering about what people think and wants to be with him. She bends down to his level and asks for forgiveness so they can be together. Alexander takes his time to react, but finally gives in and kisses Diane on the roof passionately.